Welcome everybody to the Transportation Committee hearing on Council Bill 180285 on repealing the prohibition on playing in the streets. Thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I just want to note that if you are going to be testifying, that you write your name and check the box that you're going to give testimony on the sheet that is there behind you. I'm really glad that we're here to hear this bill today. Look, I think it's important for us to consider little things, like this that, in many ways may be symbolic, but also really cause us to look at the conditions of the city that we're living in, where we really have to question a lot of the motivations of the past, where we end up criminalizing things just because it's easier than some other alternative, and that maybe it's more healthy and constructive and may take a little more critical thinking and effort. So I'm glad that we're going to have, we have Eli Poussin. I'm going to ask Eli to come up. The way I'm going to do the hearing today is I'm going to ask Eli, who is a wonderful historian, to give us a little background on these laws, and he has a slideshow, and then we're going to do agency reports, and then we'll hear some other testimony.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, one more second. Beside myself here, I'd like to begin also by introducing Vice Chairman Pinkett to my left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To his left, Dr. John Bullock. And to my right here, Richard Crumrick, the staff to the committee. And we do have folks from the Health Department, Jeff Amorose, Nina Themelis from the Mayor's Office, Hillary Ruley from the Law Department, Liam Davis from DOT, and Michelle Wurzberger from BPD. Thank you. Take it away. There's a clicker. Is there a clicker up there? Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all so much for the opportunity to share a little bit of history. When Ryan asked if I might be able to talk about the history of this bill, I sort of asked, would you like me to come and talk as a historian or a dad who likes playing with his kids in the street? And he sort of said, probably a little bit of both. So, but I'll try to focus on the history and hope to inform the debate today as much as sort of sway you to sort of one side or another. But it's actually been over 50 years since the Baltimore Sun featured the city's bans on playing in the street and trick riding on a list that they compiled of dust-covered laws and ancient rules, two of many ordinances that way back in 1946 that they had decided that the need had apparently vanished. The Sun was right to question these laws back then, but the reporter may have been a bit confused about the reason. Because by the 1940s, these laws had already been used used frequently, regularly, to turn children at play into criminals and put the police to work clearing roads for drivers instead of preventing violence or investigating crimes. So critics of the proposal we're here to discuss today might argue that the laws are today rarely enforced. But the truth is that these laws have been enforced so often and for so long that they have helped turn Baltimore into a place where many families are afraid to let their kids play in the street, even to start with. Children who do are indeed subject to harassment by the police. Of course, perhaps more so in some neighborhoods than others. These critics might come back again and say the streets are dangerous. Kids should play in parks or on playgrounds. But as the history that we're about to go through shows, parks and playgrounds have never been enough. And if a city doesn't allow kids to play in the street, are they really welcome anywhere? Regardless of our differences, we can all agree that these laws are old. I sort of began looking back, trying to find where the ban started, and I was like, wow, these are getting back pretty far. And the earliest relevant account that I could find is actually from way back in 1848, when John and Jason Hughes got caught playing ball in the street and had to pay $1 each in fines. It seems like it wasn't used that much regularly until the years after the Civil War, when baseball clubs sort of popped up on corners of nearly every every American city, Baltimore included. By 1872, at least one Baltimorean was fed up with what they called baseball maniacs and pleaded with the city for more enforcement of the then little-used ball-playing ordinance. Around the turn of the century, however, this old public safety measure took on a new role, a quick way to kick kids off the streets and make way for drivers in fast-moving cars. In 1898, the Sun reported on the outcry among children and parents after Police Marshal Samuel T. Hamilton issued what they called a far-reaching order to disperse boys who congregate in numbers upon the smoothly paved streets to play. One concerned mother wrote into the paper, "To children, play is as essential to a rational development as is food. Take it away and injure them, besides piling up trouble for parents, teachers, and even the police." One boy responded, "Why don't the police make us get off the earth altogether and be done with it? What's a fellow going to do with himself anyway? The police are always kicking about something. Just because we can't vote and ain't got any affluence, we ain't got rights." Newly paved streets did become more hazardous as cars and trucks began crowding out bicycles and horse-drawn carts. Advocates for children pushed for off-street playgrounds where young people could avoid those dual dangers of reckless drivers and police harassment. But they didn't give up on kids playing in the street either. So beginning in 1910, the Children's Playground Association of Baltimore formed a guild of play that organized supervised street play. They started the summer with just 2 locations, but the sort of wild popularity of this program meant they had expanded to 7 sites across the city by the end of that summer. By the summer of 1926, the Playground Athletic League, operating on behalf of Baltimore City, operated playgrounds across the city, including 14 roped-off street playgrounds that were sort of city streets closed to cars for the duration of the day for supervised street play. Of course, some critics even complained about these supervised street playgrounds. One testy 1914 letter complained about the, quote, roller skate fiends on his block and questioned the city's legal authority to permit the activity. In June of 1923, Police Commissioner Charles D. Gaither claimed that the officers were simply, quote, doing their duty when they arrested 3 small children, aged 10, 8, and 7, for playing with a soft rubber ball in the street in front of their own homes. Gaither argued, ball playing, kite flying, and stone throwing are forbidden by law. This is no longer as a village, and if we don't enforce these laws, somebody will be writing letters asking why we don't keep the children out of the way of automobiles. At least a few Baltimoreans pointed out that drivers had a responsibility to stay out of the way of children. In October, Mrs. William M. Malloy spoke at a meeting of the Baltimore Safety Council, explaining her view that drivers should not only have their automobiles under control at all times, but should prepare for any contingency in which the thoughtlessness of a child playing in the street might incur. So you can probably guess how the rest of this story goes. I'll sort of show it. In 1922, there was still enough outrage and indignation over the accidental injuries and deaths of children resulting from automobiles that when they held a rally downtown, the mayor sort of spoke at the opening, and they brought this giant plaster and timber-framed obelisk out to sort of memorialize the 133 children who had been killed in accidental deaths the year before. And you can see the map that indicates the locations of the playgrounds in 1926, including those 14 street playgrounds. So the city's street playgrounds had disappeared by the 1930s. Some neighborhoods had nice parks and safe places to play, but many neighborhoods didn't. In many neighborhoods, kids grew up being chased out of the street by police. Among them, former Police Commissioner Edward J. Tillman, who grew up on the 2400 block of Edding Street, just above North Avenue, and recalled that as a real part of his childhood. But the story doesn't end there. In the years after World War II, no ball playing in the streets quickly turned into no ball playing in the parks. I've found reports of no ball playing signs going up in Chinkapin Park in 1953, Wyman Park in 1954, which inspired these children living in the vicinity of University Parkway to stage a street protest. You can see the signs, sort of this noise, and explicitly say in their protest, we're getting kicked out of the park. We can't play in the street because the police will kick us out of the street just the same. So, as well as Elmley Playground, just a few blocks east of Clifton Park in 1960, among many others. Recreation centers surely helped with the shortage of play spaces, but as you all know, the number of recreation centers has dropped from over 130 in 1980 to less than 50 today. So how has all this worked out? Well, I don't have the numbers on how many fewer baseballs have broken windows as a result of the enforcement of this ordinance and the decline in street play, but it isn't looking good for kids. The federal government's official guidelines for physical activity recommend that young people get at least an hour of physical activity every day. In 2013, 3 in 10 Baltimore high school students reported less than an hour of vigorous physical activity every week. Around 1 in 4 of Baltimore's middle and high school students reported feeling socially isolated. Physical activity not only can improve physical health, it can also reduce depression and anxiety. When Project Play Baltimore surveyed 2,000 East Baltimore youth in 2017, more than 1 in 3 said they didn't have or didn't know of a safe place to play in their neighborhood. We can do better. Over the past few months, as a Bloomberg Fellow and Masters of Public Health student at Johns Hopkins University, I've been excited to work with Dr. Keisha Pollack-Porter, a leading researcher on play streets around the United States. Her research has found that policies that encourage street play can build stronger relationships between neighbors and give young people the physical activity that they need to grow up whole and healthy. Dr. Porter and I are currently working with the Department of Transportation, Bike More, Central Baltimore Partnership, the Neighborhood Design Center, and others to organize a Play Streets pilot program this spring. Changing this law can send a powerful message to kids and all the people who care about kids. Changing this law says that Baltimore City wants you to play and grow up healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Let's go on to agency reports. Can we start with the law department? Is it not on?
Well, I can pull everybody's on if you want.
Go ahead.
The law department stands by its report. You can repeal any law you enact.
Thank you. The police department.
Good afternoon, Michelle Wurzberger, Director of Government Affairs for the Baltimore Police Department, and we stand by our report. You have a question for me or the? For you. Okay.
All right, so good afternoon. One of the main question I have, do you know of any arrests or prosecutions as it relates to this law, whether in recent years or in the past few decades?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't see the police report. Did we?
There's a report. I know. I just know it's not in the package. The police department did ask for some, that didn't have a formal amendment drafted, but had some suggestions about some things. I'll touch on my thoughts on what's in there in a moment. Do you need a copy of this?
I can share with you. Go for it.
I have extras.
Oh, yes,
Do you
please.
have other copies?
May I ask a question of
Please.
the law department? Yeah. Ms. Rowley, I just had a question. I think in the law department's report, it referenced that there may be some state laws that
Yes.
that would still bear on,
Yes, it's
pedestrian-
illegal under state law to walk in the street.
Okay.
So if you repeal this, it would still be illegal under state law to do that. It's a crime. If an officer tells you to move on,
Right.
that would still be allowed. So
And so can I assume that an officer, if somebody's playing in the street, that an officer...
I don't know how to
does-
play in the street without walking in it.
Right, exactly, right. That's what thank you.
No problem.
And one follow-up question, this is for, I guess, both law and police. If this winds up being repealed, I'm just thinking down the road, and let's say someone who's playing in the street is struck by a vehicle, does that open up the city or the driver to any liability at that point?
It wouldn't be the city. It would be whoever struck the person.
I think that's to the point of comments I'll make when DOT gives their report, but essentially we have layer upon layer upon layer of criminalization at play here. That if we take away this one layer, that that peculiarly calls out this very limited thing. There's still plenty of other layering of criminalization and law in place that essentially, from what I can tell, addresses and mitigates any of the concerns that I've heard raised, particularly around safety and deterrence of certain behavior. Let's hear DOT.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Department of Transportation's position is support with amendment, and each of you should have an amendment before you. And the amendment is pretty simple, that the Department of Transportation is recommending that the bill be amended to repeal the prohibition of playing in the street on what are considered local roads. There is a national standard called the Highway Functional Classification System, FHWA, and there's generally 4 categories of streets: principal arterial, minor arterial, collector, and local. Local roads are generally designed in a manner that discourage through traffic, and the majority of roadways in Baltimore City are local. So essentially the roadways where kids would be playing, most likely, we would be repealing the prohibition, but the prohibition would stay in place on your major arterials like Pratt Street, MLK, President Street, Eastern Avenue, stuff like that. So we're really kind of approaching this from a safety standpoint. To the councilman's point that there's layer upon layer. I think we do understand that. I think what we're concerned about is if we have members of the press here today and via social media, the minute children hear, hey, it's legal to play in the street, understanding common sense is generally common, but there might be a few kids who take that a bit liberally. So again, our hope is to really find a safe compromise here, and we do agree with the intent of the bill, and this is just a recommendation from a safety standpoint.
Sure.
Liam, do you know how much Department of Transportation invested in traffic calming last year?
That's a great question. I will look into that, but I will say this: we're under the new capital budget that we're working on with the planning department now. That is going to be a larger priority going forward.
Yeah, because we're talking about playing in the street, but I think the goal should be to make streets safe for everyone. And
absolutely.
So, I'm curious. If transportation is supportive of this bill, it should be reflected in the budget.
Absolutely.
Because making the street legal for somebody to play in it doesn't make it safe.
Sure.
It's what you all do that'll make it safe.
I think we agree 100%, and one of the core tenets of our FY21 proposed capital budget is Vision Zero, where we'll have dedicated funding allocation, what will be known as quick build money for some of our highest crash intersections. So your perspective isn't falling on deaf ears, Councilman.
And more person, this is a bit of a comment, I guess, for all, and one for Eli Poussin with Baltimore Heritage. I love the picture from '73. Also, that it makes reference to model cities. If you look in the background, you look at Operation Champ, but this is also your model cities agency. If those are the background in terms of what was happening in the '60s in terms of investing in cities, I think it's pretty interesting. Could have worded my previous question a little bit differently. Let me ask it in this way. One thing that also happens in terms of pedestrian safety and traffic accidents and accidents with pedestrians is also sometimes we know that pedestrians and bicyclists are in the right and they may get hurt, but then also when there's pedestrian error. And so what I'm also considering here is, to the question I was asked before, if folks say, hey, kids can play in the street now, it's all good, and then there is some kind of error, kids running after a ball, the driver doesn't see it, hits the kid, that driver is now not in a position where now they're being criminalized because they hit. Does people see where I'm going with this? So are we kind of on the same page here? Okay.
Liam, can you tell me how many, what's the number of pedestrian-involved accidents that we had in the city last year?
So I don't know the accidents offhand. I know that there were just under 40 fatalities involving traffic-related accidents, and I think of those, roughly 35 to 40, roughly 15 to 20 involved pedestrians. What's interesting about that data, and it's not, I don't want anybody to take this as there needs to be more looking into it, but what was interesting is when the city had to shut down the speed and red light camera program, we actually saw an uptick in the amount of pedestrian and auto crash fatalities. And then once the program was jump-started again, it trailed back off. So you can literally see, like if I put a graph up for you that showed camera revenue dropping, you would then see fatalities increasing. And again, we got to be careful because it's not, like correlation doesn't mean causation. I heard that on Twitter, but it's definitely a compelling argument, and it kind of supports what we like to say is that those programs, the revenue generating aspect is a bonus. Really, the safety component is why we really embrace those programs.
And so you wouldn't know how many of those were children that were?
I can do my best to get that data for you. That'll be a homework assignment for me.
Another question, since you brought up the speed cameras, I think presently we have them situated in proximity to schools. Is there potential for them to be situated in other areas, for example, parks and rec centers?
So the great thing about Baltimore City is, due to our compact footprint, we have way more, there's a higher percentage of the city that can get covered than, I guess, in most localities. Going into session, we are asking for some additional state authorization, and it's still in, the bill hasn't dropped yet. It's still being crafted, but we're going to be asking for authorization for a speed camera on Interstate 83. And that's following successful legislation from Prince George's County that got state permission to install a camera on Indian Head Highway where they had a high rate of crashes. So we're kind of using that same strategy for Interstate 83. And then from there, I think we might be able to get creative with what you're thinking. But another bill too we're looking at is something that I think Councilman Dorsey was pushing last session, which is local authority to set maximum speed limits without a engineering study.
Gotcha. Just one other question, and I'm not certain if this would be more appropriate for rec and parks, but do you know how frequently last year Safety City was utilized? And is it utilized at all?
I can follow up with you on that. I don't know that off the top of my head. Thank you.
Thank you.
Liam, thank you for your report. I would just, I forget exactly how you put it, but essentially, for me to believe that people will become less safe if we say that this is no longer criminal, I would have to believe that it's actually this law that is making them safe right now. And I definitely do not believe that, because I don't believe that of all the children in the city, that even 1% of them are aware that this law exists or has ever had the existence of this law mentioned to them in their lives. I believe that people don't play in the middle of MLK or Northern Parkway or on 83 or President Street for that matter, because it's just so obviously, harrowingly unsafe. And people have common sense. And before the hearing began, my colleagues said, my kids don't play in the street. It's not, it's not necessarily safe. I spent my whole childhood in Bel Air Edison playing step ball with a tennis ball on the steps in front of my cousin's house on Woodstock Avenue. And in the alley between Chesterfield and the 2800 blocks of Chesterfield and Pelham, where I lived, and doing everything that this law says is unlawful. But I didn't go out in the middle of Bel Air Road at the end of my block. It was closer than my cousin's house on Woodstock, but I didn't go out on the Bel Air Road to play there because it's just obvious that that's unsafe. And I'm sure that somebody here today is going to say something to the effect, somebody giving public testimony is going to likely mention that, kids have an opportunity to learn through play, and that it's important that we give kids the freedom to learn through environment and circumstance and different conditions. And if we are intent on charging somebody with a crime or thinking that it's the existence of a law that is keeping somebody from engaging in unsafe behavior, well, as was mentioned before, there is layer upon layer of law here. It is unlawful at both the state and local level to obstruct traffic. When we talk about throwing balls and the damage that could possibly ensue to somebody's private property, it doesn't have to be unlawful to throw something down the street in order for us to say that destruction of property is already unlawful. And so I think that the concerns that I've heard are already addressed by other prohibitions at the local and at the state level. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Health Department?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Jeff Amaris for the Health Department. We stand by our report and defer to BPD.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fire? You submitted a report, yeah?
Good afternoon. I'm Lieutenant Banks from the Fire Marshal's Office, representing the Fire Department. Chief Reddy stepped out. He told me to let you guys know that as long as the Fire Department had access, they wouldn't have any objections.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How about some public testimony? First signed up is Jed Weeks from Bikemore.
Hi, Jed Weeks with Bikemore, Policy Director and Registered Lobbyist. We're strongly in support of this. I think you heard plenty from Eli, and you'll probably hear from others as to why this is a good idea. I think the only things I would add are we are working actively with Eli Poussin, Dr. Keisha Pollock-Porter at Hopkins, and some others on a pilot Play Streets program for Baltimore City that hopefully we'll be able to launch this spring or summer, which would be like a permitted program that allows neighbors to temporarily close their neighborhood streets to play in them. But I think it's really confusing to have something like this on the books while we're also like working on things like that, and it'd be really nice to just have it simplified. And then since cameras came up, I think I'd be remiss not to mention them as well, just to answer a couple questions. In other cities that have actually studied the removal and reintroduction of camera programs, controlling for other factors, they have found exactly what what was being talked about with DOT here, that when the cameras go away, things get worse, and when the cameras come back, things get better. So that is, I mean, again, correlation is not causation in Baltimore because we don't know exactly, but in every other city it's been studied, it's causation. So anyway, that's cameras, but we're really supportive of repealing this legislation. We should be looking at any opportunity to get kids playing more. And then with the amendment that DOT proposed, I'd prefer not to see that happen, only because the neighborhoods that need play the most and need to be focusing on having traffic calming and other elements the most are essentially our historically redlined neighborhoods where we paved wider roads via white flight through and classified roadways via the Federal Highways Functional Classification in ways that were really, inappropriate. And that expands beyond just those neighborhoods. So, for example, in Councilman Dorsey's district, Crossland Avenue is federally highway classified. It's not a local street, but it's a local street. Or Baker Street in West Baltimore is a local street, but it's classified under this. So I think it would make sense to just, especially as we're moving to create a new classification system under complete streets, just wholesale repeal this and go from there.
Thanks, Jed. Just a quick question. You mentioned the development of a pilot program related to playing in the street. Can you speak to what the process is to identify, what would be, I guess, the type of street that you would be looking at to? Because
So with,
this isn't going to make the cars go away.
Yeah, with a program like that, where we're focused specifically on endorsing play in streets and actively trying to get people to play in streets, it would be local neighborhood streets, probably without a bus line. And then we would probably try to find and prioritize for the pilot program neighborhoods that have high zero car access, have lack of recreational opportunities in terms of their parks, like maybe they have poor playgrounds, no playgrounds, lack of access to a recreation center, and then have a high density of children.
Okay, thank you.
Don't mean to interrupt, but I learned earlier this week that our planners are actually looking into creating a separate permit that would actually be a play permit for the streets. That would be kind of similar to our block party permits. Yeah, so I think it's the same initiative. So we're actively looking into it.
Right, yeah, so we're working with the planners at DOT on that, and we'll either, have that permit developed in time, or we'll go through this pilot program through the block party permit while we're developing the permit with DOT, but.
So again, thank you for your testimony. I know Councilman Dorsey has another amendment that has to do with a bicyclist, but I do want to ask you, since you're representing Bike More, you mentioned, I know that Bike More is more than just bicyclists, about pedestrian and play as well, but how do you see this affecting bicyclists, if at all?
So I think it's not, it's not directly connected to bicycles, and that, it is legal to ride a bicycle on city streets already. But anytime you're getting people to think about streets differently and to think about how they can utilize public space differently, that helps with people reframing their mind around transportation access and access to opportunity in different ways. So that's sort of our interest here from the bike lens. There are definitely other pieces of code related to bicycles that have had a similar history like this of being disparately enforced or otherwise problematic or racist that need to be looked at in the future. But I think this is a good start to sort of having those conversations.
Before you go anywhere, I do have this amendment. Calling you up reminded me that I had my own amendment that I will offer at some point here. To additionally repeal other similar prohibitions from Article 31, Subtitle 18 on bicycles, which prohibits coasting or trick riding. It is unlawful for any person riding a bicycle on any of the streets, lanes, alleys, or public ways of this city to coast by inertia or momentum without having both feet on the pedals, to ride with at least one hand without at least one hand firmly gripping the handles. It's still an amazing thing that I can ride down the street with no hands on my bike. That doesn't stop being awesome feeling at any age in life. Not me, man. Not for John.
But yeah, to the point of that amendment, like it's crazy that we are criminalizing popping a wheelie at bike party. You know, like a 12-year-old boy should be able to do that in a safe space, or a 12-year-old girl should be able to do that in a safe space. And it's crazy that that's technically illegal. It's crazy that a bike that has more than one person on it is technically illegal under our code. I know people that ride their children to school or to work every day on bikes with a little cargo thing, and it's crazy that that's illegal. So, updating all of this is great.
And so there are these other number of things related to the number of people on a bike that are also in that, but because there is a concern about parity with other sections of the city code related to dockless vehicles and such, I didn't want to delve into the technical minutia of that, but still think it's worthwhile saying, look, while we're taking off the books something that criminalizes very common youthful behavior that is harmless, it's worth adding these in here. And so that's what this is all about. Thank you, Jed.
Yep, thank you.
I'm sorry, Jed. So the permit that you all are working on, would that allow for play in the street under the existing laws?
Unclear. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I feel like it would not. But in theory, the block party permit also would not allow a block party to occur because you're walking in the street, like if we're going by that street.
Right. So maybe it would, because if the law states that it's illegal for you to walk in the street, but we can get a permit that would allow essentially for people to walk in the street, I would imagine that you could create a law that would allow for a permit to be issued for play in the street.
I think it's just very confusing to have like a code that says you can't and then a permit that says you can. So I think it's just easier to have default decriminalization and then a permit to apply for like really special events where you...
No, I mean, and I get you. So, and neither one of us are lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that the permit for a block party is so that someone just doesn't, take it upon themselves to say, all right, 50 of my friends come,
right,
and we're just going to block the street off and do what we want. What would keep 50 kids from saying, well, now that it's legal to play in the street, this is our street now?
The state law that prohibits, the state law and also the local law that prohibit obstructing traffic.
Right. So are we going to try to get the state law repealed?
No.
I can't speak for council, but we're very supportive of reclaiming our streets and having more opportunities for play on them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ben Dalby, Free for All Baltimore.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben Dalby. I'm co-founder of an organization called Free for All Baltimore, which is a local nonprofit organization. We provide free open access play opportunities for youth in Northeast Baltimore City. We are a proud and successful Year 1 grantee with the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. We've served over 250 children with our after-school programming over the last 3 years, and we are right now staffing and running free programming 3 days a week after school in a previously closed Baltimore City Recreation and Parks building. And I'm here to speak in support of the bill because it is a small and important step, I think, in prioritizing the lives of and interests of children, and particularly black children in our city. We know that all children play. It's what kids do all the time. Big kids, little kids, in all kinds of situations, in all kinds of circumstances. But our dominant institutions and culture of white supremacy do not value, protect, or provide for the play of all children equally. And the history of demography of Northeast Baltimore in particular means that there are thousands of mostly black children moving through our neighborhoods every day, living out their childhoods under a pall of racism and white supremacy. Kids doing things like going to and from school, playing outside in their own neighborhoods. We are familiar with the Barbecue Becky phenomenon. Northeast Baltimore is full of white people, my social peers, who see it as their civic responsibility to police the behavior of black youth. I'm speaking of things like seeing online that your neighbor's scooters have been stolen, and then seeing some black kids riding scooters down the street and calling the police because you're assuming that they're thieves when in fact their dad has bought them scooters. Now I'm speaking of things like harassing middle school kids, trying to stop to talk to each other as they're walking down the sidewalk after school, when in fact they're just enjoying time with their friends and are quite literally looking for a place to be. And then there is the institutional racism built in policing the behavior of black youth seeking opportunities for recreation in the very few public spaces that do exist in our city. I've seen a black boy threatened with handcuffs in the library for the crime of pulling a chair out from underneath his friend as he was getting ready to sit down, which is a behavior that for a free child would be considered a classic prank. Threatened with handcuffs. The school my children attend is a typical Baltimore City school in that it is mostly black. The grades are pre-K through 8th grade. There are almost 900 kids in the building, and there is no usable playground. The existing equipment is old and in such a dangerous state of disrepair that the school community has fenced it off for the year, while we are working to find money for repairs and looking for a long-term solution for a new play space. This is my son's 9th year at that school. My daughter's in the 5th grade. For several of each of those 9 years, a child has been struck by a car somewhere outside school at dismissal. It's a strange word to use in this context, but I will say, thankfully, the most severe injuries that I know have been broken bones. We've tried for years unsuccessfully so far to get an additional crossing guard to attend to the extremely dangerous four-way intersection at Harford Road and Old Harford Road and Glenmore Avenue. A child will be struck by a car at that intersection. An adult was just hit there about a month ago. Unfortunately, I'm sure there are plenty of other situations like this across the city, and for those of us who are concerned about cars and children's safety as I am, I think those places would be good places to start. When my colleague and I started Free for All Baltimore, we did some research and found that there are 7 schools with 3,200 students within a mile radius of our site. 2,000 of those kids have no recreation center or park within walking distance of their homes. We do have a lot of streets. Often they are quiet, open spaces that invite playful activity. In our current context, the ordinance prohibiting playing in the street could only be enforced in ways that reinforce racism and oppression and deny the participation of children in the life of their own communities. I think repealing the prohibition is an important step toward creating public space for children. I think repealing the prohibition may be more important for the message it can send to our communities, which is a message I believe needs to be augmented and amplified, which is that all of us have a responsibility to organize our city around meeting the needs and serving the interests of the 90,000 black kids who call Baltimore home and should feel and be at home here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Ashia Parker.
Good afternoon. I'm Ashia Parker. I'm the Executive Director of the No Boundaries Coalition. We support 7 West Baltimore neighborhoods. Have 2 of my council people serving on this committee today. Thank you for your service. I won't be before you long, but I wanted to testify and support in person. No Boundaries has a youth organizing program that we are teaching kids to advocate for issues that are important to them and to also serve as community organizers, which means that you must be in the community. Community organizing to teenagers looks a lot different than it does to me. It could be them walking down the street with a basketball to entice other children to come out to join them and to play with them. Part of my support is just repealing another law that would unfairly criminalize children, especially black children, in West Baltimore, which is heavily criminalized anyway. As stated earlier today, most children do not know that this is a law, but the police know that this is a law, and this can just be another tool in their toolbox to unfairly target black kids. They may just be walking or engaging in everyday play or socializing. So I hope that this bill is under consideration to this committee and all of the agencies that are here today.
Ashia, are you familiar with anyone who's been arrested or received a citation for this?
No, I'm not.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shia. Brianna Heinzen, and are you both going to testify? Yeah, I mean, you're both from NDC. I don't know if you came together. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Bryony Hinson with the Neighborhood Design Center. I'm the Deputy Director.
I'm Jennifer Gould, also with NDC. I'm the Director.
Thank you for hearing us today. Play is not a frivolity. Access to play is a human right acknowledged by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 31. Play is critical in human development and the social, emotional, intellectual, and physical development of all children. We know that barriers to play for urban youth in Baltimore are significant, and they're exacerbated by lack of access to parks and play spaces, by actual and perceived crime and violence, long school commutes, screen time, you name it. There are a number of barriers. With all of these existing barriers, additional criminalization of play compounds the problem. It's unnecessary and damaging, and it disproportionately impacts our lowest income and most vulnerable community members. An example that you've been asking for, and working in 2012 in the care community, I heard about an effort by the community to turn a vacant lot into a play site. Got involved and was surprised. It turned out to discover that it was being led by a 12-year-old who was moved to lead this project after he had encountered a 10-year-old friend of his being handcuffed for having ignored the no ball play signs. So it's, I wasn't there, but that was the story of this initiative within this community. So we can't rest on the hope that the ordinance isn't enforced and that it won't be disproportionately enforced because we know it has been. So do you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
the NDC?
So NDC, we provide pro bono design services for a community-initiated project. Over our 50-year history, we've worked on over 4,000 projects, 2,500 projects, and over 10% of those have been play spaces. So communities know that play is really needed in their neighborhood. In the past few years alone, we've worked on the Wonderground in Greenmount West, Henrietta Lacks Park in Johnson Square, German Park in Reservoir Hill, Bethel Street Playscape in Oliver, a recreation plan for Reservoir Hill and Penn North, as well as the Gateway Park in Gateway in Darley Park. And we know that children play coming and going from those places. Play doesn't stop from the moment you leave your house to crossing the crosswalk to arriving in your neighborhood park. And in many times, you're getting home from school and you're there alone. Mom and dad are at work, and you're going to play on the sidewalk. You're going to play on the stoop. And the no ball play signs do embolden people to call the police when children are playing in the street, and perhaps arrests aren't happening, but I know that the police do engage children that are engaged in play, and it creates an unnecessary layer of conflict between children, adults, and police in the public realm that can really start everyone down that pathway towards long-term criminalization. And as Bryony said, play is a human right. Children have to have play for their brain development. So many studies have shown that one of the major impacts on socialization for children is restricted access to play. And for children that are living in city streets are the place to play, and that is essential to their socialization. So NDC, we're also supporting on the design side the Play Streets program. Many urban places have Play Streets programs, and showing that Baltimore is a progressive place where we understand the rights of children and support them, I think is taking laws like this off the books is essential.
Thank you. I am reminded to comment here that when I introduced this bill in 2018, talking with Councilman Scott at the time, before becoming council president, we talked about how he grew up in Park Heights, I grew up in Bel Air Edison, and I never once had police arrive as the response to somebody calling the cops on me, but he could not say the same.
I'm just curious, how would you define play?
How would we define play?
Yeah.
Play is really the activity of children pretty much all of their time, that they aren't being enforced to do something else, because it takes place in imagination, it takes place in active play through running, throwing balls, it takes place in games. So play is really the primary activity of children, but it is a very socialized element of the activity of children. So you primarily see it, I think, anytime there are multiple children engaging with one another, although children can passively play doing things like video games as well. It doesn't have the same quality of emotional and socialization skills as children playing together out in public.
So like outdoor playing, would a basketball court be considered play?
Yes.
So could feasibly somebody could set up a basketball court in the street?
Absolutely.
I mean, if somebody had a
like that is a basketball
right,
court
exactly.
in the street.
If somebody had, like my mother has one, she has a tennis net.
Yep, and just roll it out there.
You could just put that. You could put that in the street.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
Unless prohibited by other layers of
the
law that exist.
And certainly, you can play in the street without obstructing traffic. I think we observe older children all the time out throwing a ball in the street. They have a set up so that you can see the end of the block, and they just get out of the road when a slow car comes through.
Right.
It is possible to play in the street without obstructing traffic.
And additionally, we're saying street over and over again, but this includes alleys as well, where there are plenty of alleys in the community where maybe one car a day will come through, but the primary activation of that space for public use is by people on their feet, and those are children that are playing.
I'm also reminded. I'm also reminded of how of the I want to say peculiar specificity within the law as it exists. A child, if we're to believe that this law is making kids safer, then as it's written, what it expresses is that we only care if they happen to be maybe bouncing a ball. But if they're out there playing tag, we don't care how unsafe they are, right? Because it doesn't actually prohibit playing in the street. It prohibits ball playing in the street and kite flying in the street. And so it doesn't wholesale say you can't go out there.
Right.
It's just the specificity of it is.
And I do know that I've heard many anecdotes about children the police being called in regards to balls hitting cars. And so I think the no ball playing rule really allows people to feel like, okay, anytime I see a ball out, I can threaten the child that there's no ball playing because it might bounce against a piece of personal property.
I think this is also, Eli gave us great history that really expresses that at some point we made a conscious social decision to prioritize, for example, the storage of private automobiles, the storage of private property in our public space, and value our public space as private storage space over use of public space in general. And to me, it's just like it's beyond the pale to say not only are we going to prioritize private storage of material goods in the public street, but we're also going to criminalize other non-harmful uses of that. It's a layer too much. Thank you.
So, thank you.
Did I see Shamoya? Thank you. We had collected the sign-in sheet before you came in.
I was struggling with the parking meter. All right. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Shamoya Gardiner. I serve as Education Policy Director at Advocates for Children and Youth. ACY is a statewide nonprofit with the mission of supporting policies and programs to ensure that all children, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or place of birth, can actually thrive. That is why we are supporting this bill It makes absolutely no sense to have this ordinance on the books, which, as has been said many times in this hearing, criminalizes the behavior of children, which is extremely natural, and we have already noted the disproportionate impact of the criminalization of childlike behaviors on Black children. Of all of the young people from Baltimore City who were taken in by the Department of Juvenile Services in 2018, 94% were Black, in a city where a little over 60% of our residents are. The disparity is completely illogical. It makes no sense, which is why ACY is supporting this effort. Questions?
Thank you.
No, I was just curious, were any of the young people that you mentioned, were they arrested because they were playing in the street?
So the Department of Juvenile Services doesn't provide that much data, that detailed, sadly. Can work on that. Thank you.
Is there anybody else that wanted to give testimony that didn't sign up, didn't get called? Okay, thank you all. I'm going to put forth this amendment to my colleagues here. I'd like to take a vote about this amendment. I'd like to move this amendment. All in favor? Aye.
So it looks like it's two amendments.
I'm sorry. These two amendments in front of us, one retitles, the first one retitles the bill as would be necessary. Sorry, there's two amendments on that are my amendment. Okay. You have my amendment and you have the DOT amendment. I'm moving my two amendments here. Amendment number 2 adds in the language for repeal around the cycling stuff, and which then expands the scope of the bill beyond what is contained solely in Article 19 of the City Code. And so it can no longer be titled appropriately as police ordinances repealing it has to be more general in scope there. And so it retitles the bills so I move the bill. Councilman Bullock seconded. I'm going to do a roll call. Councilman Dorsey, yes. Councilman Pinkett?
Abstain.
Councilman Bullock? Yes. The amendment passes favorable. I'm going to move the bill as amended. I make a motion to move the bill as amended. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilman Bullock. Councilman Dorsey votes yes. Councilman Pinkett?
Abstain.
Councilman Bullock? Yes. That is 2 in favor, 1 abstention. The bill passes as amended and will be heard on second reader on the next council meeting. Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate all of your time and your testimony. Thank you. This hearing is adjourned.